The letter was in her hand, his eyes were already on the child. She enters the room ready to resign, spine straight, voice steady, heart locked down. He stands by the window like a man made of stone, then turns, crosses the room, and destroys her last illusion with a whisper. You're pregnant. In that instant, the office becomes a battlefield. The resignation letter becomes useless paper, and two wounded souls collide under the shadow of Mafia blood and unfinished desire. But the real tragedy begins later, when love arrives hand in hand with the suspicion that it was built on a lie.
And here, the narrative fractures. She concealed the entire affair, the night, its emotional fallout, and the child. Alessia believed a clean exit was possible, that she could leave no evidence of her existence. He, however, cornered her with predatory certainty, stating simply, "You're not going anywhere." The final pronouncement followed, "This baby is mine." In that moment, her illusion of agency evaporated. I am Alessia, and this is the precipice. Chapter 1. The Ignored Omen. The day was deceptively perfect. Excellent coffee, clear skies, a beautifully set trap. The blazer was immaculate, the contract signed just the day prior. A role pursued for 2 years was now hers, with double the salary. Her office, a 20-minute drive away. Portfolio in hand, she walked, convinced her life's fragmented pieces were finally aligning. Her first call was to Lorenzo, an unshakable constant since they were 12. He was the primary recipient of all her narratives, good or bad, a fundamental ritual. Certain patterns are simply immutable. This particular pattern had never presented as a liability. He answered on the second ring, her customary signal. I secured the position, she stated, bypassing pleasantries. Signed yesterday. It's with Viscari Holdings. A silence followed, lasting a full 3 seconds. The tension was palpable. She understood her brother's pauses. This was not a celebratory silence. Viscari, he repeated, the name tasting like a poison on his tongue. Viscari Holdings. Yes, she affirmed, a sudden chill creeping in. Are you familiar with them? He responded, I am familiar with the owner. And just like that, his voice shifted into a grave register, a tone Lorenzo reserved for imminent catastrophe. It was devoid of panic, free of drama, merely the calm delivery of a man announcing an unavoidable impact. Explain, she commanded, and he complied. He withheld the full story, a fact she would only recognize much later, revealing just enough to prevent her from resigning on the spot. It was more than sufficient. Dante Viscari, 35, presided over an empire that rendered his CEO title a meaningless formality. This man's authority wasn't documented on paper. It existed in whispers and in problems that simply ceased to be. He was one of the most respected figures in the Mafia. A connoisseur of moments, not conquests. He reportedly never entertained the same woman twice. Alessia, Lorenzo began, his tone a clear attempt to breach her defenses. This man will notice you. Men of his archetype always do. She merely laughed. It was not a cruel sound, but that of a younger sister accustomed to 15 years of her brother's perceived hyperbole. After all, Lorenzo had forbidden her from cycling at 13 and was convinced she would become lost on the subway at 18. He perceived danger in every shadow. Lorenzo, she said with practiced patience, I am an executive assistant. My duties involve schedules and reports. He retorted, his voice unnervingly level, far more intimidating than a shout. You will be entering his office every single day. I will perform my duties, she insisted. A boundary exists. For you, it does. For him, perhaps not. She fell silent for a moment. Her silence wasn't born of conviction, but from the unnerving accuracy in his tone, striking a nerve she preferred to ignore. Lorenzo wasn't being dramatic, he was being clinical. You're making me fear a man I haven't even met, she admitted. I'm preparing you, he countered. He paused, allowing the gravity of his words to settle. He doesn't engage in conventional flirtation, ally. He has no need for words. He utilizes his presence. You will feel it before you can name it. And by that point, it is far too late. She wanted to dismiss his claims, to assert her status as an adult woman capable of managing a boss with a reputation. She attempted to, projecting the confidence of the uninformed. It's not about being interested, Lorenzo interjected. It's about his methodology. Your lack of interest is irrelevant to the effect he has. The two are not connected. The line grew quiet again. The sun climbed higher, street noise intensified, and her grip on the phone became punishingly tight. Promise me you will call if anything feels wrong, he asked. His tone was that of a pure protector, stripped of all judgment. She inhaled deeply, then offered her absolute truth in that instant. I promise I will feel nothing at all. She was sincere. It was not irony or ego, but a profound, blissful ignorance she would later come to regret. She then called Sophia, whose reaction was ecstatic, immediately planning a celebration. She did not relay Lorenzo's warning. She compartmentalized it and moved forward, energized by the prospect of her new life. She was correct about embarking on a new chapter. She was profoundly mistaken about what lay on the other side of that office door. 10 floors above, Dante Viscari was examining her resume. It was standard protocol. He didn't finish reading, simply closing the folder and discarding it. He then sat, gazing out the window. Marco, his confidant, would later say it was the only time he was ever uncertain of his boss's thoughts. Chapter 2. The Encounter. The Viscari Tower was a monument of glass and steel, an architectural assertion of superiority. The receptionist verified her name, created a badge, and then hesitated. Good luck, the woman whispered, her smile a plastic formality that failed to reach her eyes, a familiar brand of polite indifference. Alessia fixed the badge and moved towards the elevator, interpreting those 2 words as a significant omen. The 10th floor was unnervingly silent. It wasn't unoccupied, but possessed the charged quietude of a place where conversations are conducted in hushed tones. Other assistants observed her, likely placing silent wagers on her longevity. She knocked, entered, and stopped. Dante Viscari did not look up. He sat, pen poised, yet she could feel his awareness of her. He knew. This was not a function of being busy. It was a calculated display of power. He was forcing her to experience the gravity of the space before uttering a single word. She remained by the door, counting 45 seconds of suppressed indignation, fully aware of his strategy. It was long enough to register the scent of expensive materials and understand he required no speech to command his environment. Then his head lifted slowly, without haste. His eyes met hers. This was not an employer assessing a new employee. This was a man who had discovered an object of interest and intended to study it at his leisure. An involuntary, visceral reaction ignited within her. Lorenzo's warning materialized in her mind. He is going to see you. His type always does. She straightened her posture. She resolved in that instant that this man would never perceive her unease. She would be the embodiment of professionalism, efficiency, an impenetrable wall, whatever was necessary. Romano, he said. His voice was low and precise, each word landing with intent. Yes, she responded. Sit. The word was not a request, it was a command. It was an unequivocal directive, devoid of any social nicety. The power dynamic was palpable in the atmosphere. in his posture, in the unwavering gaze that held her. She took her seat, opened her laptop, arranged her folder, and clicked her pen. The familiar rituals of a meeting. Then she met his stare directly, refusing to be the first to break contact. He simply observed her, utterly still, and the silence began to erode her composure. "You have reviewed the job description," he stated. "A declaration, not a question." It was an assertion of fact. "I have," she replied, "and I have prepared a summary for week 1. If you wish to review it." He cut her off abruptly. "Unnecessary," he clipped. "I am aware of the priorities." He then returned his attention to his documents, signaling the conversation was terminated. She held his gaze for a fraction of a second, a minute act of defiance before activating her laptop. The lines of engagement were now drawn, the greatest insult being his pretense that no conflict existed, or worse, his full awareness of it and his dismissal of her as an opponent. The morning passed quickly as she acclimated to the office's cadence. At 11, he spoke her name without looking up, but the document was already in her hand. He reviewed it, the silence extending just beyond a comfortable length. "Correct." But then she saw it. His gaze shifted to her, intense and utterly unprofessional, before returning to the page. There was no attempt at subtlety. The realization struck her. Her brother, Lorenzo, had not been exaggerating. This man saw her. The deeper truth, one she wouldn't concede until much later, was that she had also seen him, and from that there was no retreat. Chapter 3. The Forbidden Atmosphere. The initial 2 months were a quiet conflict, a battle she was fighting before she knew she was a combatant. It began with that first assessment, that first command, and the unrecorded meetings, abrupt summons with enigmatic men who would vanish as quickly as they appeared. Gradually, the facade of Dante Viscari, legitimate CEO, began to crumble. A name, Srokin, appeared on a document that reached her desk by mistake. The name meant nothing to her, but the way Marco retrieved the paper, his eyes communicating "you saw nothing," conveyed its significance. This was a name to be feared. In response, she established her own principles. Be professional, be formidable, be unassailable. It became a necessity once she understood the office was a front for a more serious enterprise. Amid clandestine meetings and coded language, she constructed a fortress of sheer competence. She submitted work ahead of schedule, anticipated his needs, and resolved issues no one else would touch. This was her own assertion of power, not a bid for his approval. His standards were mercilessly high, reflecting a man accustomed to life or death stakes. If her work was deficient, he stated it plainly. Yet when she performed exceptionally, his silence was profound. He noticed, she could feel his awareness. Had he been merely a demanding superior, she could have managed. The true complication was his attention, the way he observed everything, not randomly, but with a terrifying deliberation. He never reacted, he only made decisions. He watched her with the same intense focus she applied to him, shattering any notion of him being just a boss. By the end of the first month, small, seemingly insignificant details began to accumulate, ensnaring her before she could feign ignorance. It started with coffee. Her ritual was consistent, small, black, no sugar, every day. The game began with a ritual. One Monday, a coffee materialized at the break room, her name inscribed in his severe, unadorned script. She observed it for 3 beats before Carla from finance offered a cryptic verdict. "Welcome to the club." She declined to probe, simply accepting the offering. No words were exchanged. Yet each morning thereafter, the tribute reappeared. A minor gesture, perhaps, but such things are the seeds from which immense consequences grow. The second signal was a dress of green, her chosen armor for days demanding a warrior's spirit. It commanded a room without a sound. She wore it one Thursday in their second month, needing its power for a critical presentation. Dante promptly canceled the 11 o'clock meeting, offering no pretext. He remained in his office, and all day his observation of her felt different. Not overt, but heavier, as if an unseen dial controlling its intensity had been discreetly turned. The truth was in his gaze, which held hers a fraction of a second too long. It was in the microscopic pause after her surname, a silence without function. It existed in the charged electric space between them at his desk. She avoided the green dress the following week. It was two more before she could admit why. The third sign obliterated her defenses. At that second month's end, a dinner was held with partner executives. Her role was to be the perfect, invisible assistant. The evening unfolded flawlessly until an executive, 50-ish and overserved, uttered something vile as she passed. The words were lost, but the intent was clear. The following morning, Dante severed the company's contract with the man. The official memo, written by Marco, cited long-term strategic divergences, a corporate fiction all tacitly accepted. And Marco Vitali, their constant observer, allowed himself a brief, knowing smile. Marco neither concealed nor brandished his knowledge. He simply let it be, a gesture that spoke volumes. She learned of the dissolved contract through a forwarded email. For a long moment she stared at the screen, consumed by a new, untamable emotion, a fusion of warmth and profound dread. That night, she told Lorenzo a curated version of her day. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she replied. The unedited truth was reserved for Sophia, the one who never judged and never uttered the words, "I told you so." Sophia simply absorbs, analyzes, and then delivers the unsparing truth. By the third month, the office's ambient tension had shifted. One could sense it in the after-hours stillness, feel it in the charged air as he walked by, hear a new weight in his words. She developed a constant radar for his location. An instinct informed her of his movements when he was rising, approaching, or lingering near her desk for a moment too long. It was the way he pronounced her surname, Romano. From him, it was never just a name. His tone was no professional summons. Uttering her name was a boundary he crossed with slow, deliberate intent, like a man assured of his ultimate victory. Her sole defense was feigned ignorance. Then a mundane Wednesday afternoon ceased to be mundane. She was arranging documents at the conference table. The office was emptying, leaving behind the taut quiet of a recently departed crowd. Under dim lighting, in the building's silence, she was absorbed in a flawed report. Then she registered the sound of Dante's office door. She knew his footfalls by heart, the cadence, the weight, the measured rhythm. Her mind had been cataloging these details for weeks. His steps approached the bookshelf directly behind her. The room was vast. A multitude of paths were available to him, yet he chose the one that placed him directly in her wake. In a sequence she can still visualize with crystalline clarity. His hand made contact with her back. It was the faintest pressure, the barest whisper of fingertips against her hip, lasting less than 2 seconds. One might dismiss it as accidental, were it not for the fractional pause in his stride, a minute hesitation before his pace resumed. It was no mistake. An unspoken understanding passed between them. She rose from her seat, the ember of his touch igniting a fire within her, a presence that had no intention of departing. Consider this. He was already across the room, absorbed in a file, as if the preceding moment had never occurred. He was the picture of composure, a man of broad shoulders and economical movements betraying nothing. The silence that fell between them was suddenly charged with a new significance. She concluded her tasks, her own motions measured, as if a single misstep could release a truth she was unequipped to face. Gathering her belongings, her purse, she exited without a backward glance, the one action she could not permit herself. That touch lingered for hours, a phantom warmth she carried into the restaurant where, with Sophia, the confession finally escaped. It surfaced unbidden, as profound secrets often do in trusted company. "He made contact with me," she uttered. Sophia's glass met the table with a sharp crack. "How?" "On my back, as he passed." Alicia lifted her own wine with surgical precision. "Alicia," her friend began, using the tone reserved for a truth both obvious and painful. "A man like him commits no accidents." She knew, she had known with the instantaneous clarity that arrives at the least opportune moments. But hearing Sophia articulate it made the fact concrete, undeniable. "And then what?" Sophia pressed. "And then nothing," she answered. "He's my boss." Sophia just watched her, 1,000 unsaid things vying for a place to begin. "For now," she said at last, and signaled for more wine. Chapter 4. The Game of Risk. By the 5th month, Dante's professional facade had begun to fray, not in any tangible way she could document, but in a way she felt deep in her bones. She had spent too much time decoding his silences to feign ignorance any longer. It began in the elevator. They entered together on a Thursday after a late meeting, the air thick with residual tension, just the two of them. He pressed the button for the ground floor, the door sealed, and the small space became suffocating. She fixed her eyes on the doors, a fragile shield. He stood behind her. His scent arrived first, wood, amber, and an unidentifiable note she had indexed weeks ago. She stared at the doors, her focus a desperate defense. Yet some part of her knew that shield was about to be shattered. With 3 floors remaining, he shifted closer, 1 centimeter. In that confined space, that oppressive silence, a single centimeter redrew the map between professional distance and something else entirely. "You wear this dress deliberately," he stated. His voice was so low she felt its vibration on her skin before she registered the words. It was not a question. It was a final judgment, delivered with the unnerving calm of a man who has solved the entire puzzle. Without turning, she replied in the most level tone she could muster. "I wear what I choose." "I know," he answered, allowing a pause before delivering the final blow. "That is the problem." The doors parted. She exited with the air of someone with an urgent destination. Only once she was safely out of his sight did she release the breath she had held since the 3rd floor. He waited a full 2 seconds before stepping out. She did not witness it, but she knew. In the same way she could locate him in any room, she knew he remained still, and she understood precisely what those 2 seconds signified. The Milan trip was scheduled for 2 weeks later. A dense itinerary of meetings, a logistical plan she had perfected, and separate suites on the same hotel floor. Relief washed over her at that detail, followed by irritation at her own relief. It implied she had considered the alternative, a path she refused to entertain. The first day was a grueling technical affair. In one meeting, she identified a critical error in an executive's data before anyone else, and she spoke. The room fell completely still. Dante turned to her. He did not smile, but his eyes communicated something she instinctively cataloged. That evening, she was in the hotel bar, laptop open with the genuine intent of working for another 2 hours. A simple dress, her hair down, wine as a minor reward. And then he was there. He took the seat beside her, not across. His arm was inches from her own, his presence a palpable warmth that preceded him as always. "The work is finished," he said. "I know," she replied, and closed the laptop. Just like that, without protest or question, a surrender that terrified her. She chose not to analyze it, because to think was to leave, and she wanted to stay. That was the difficult truth. They remained at the bar for an hour and a half. His conversation was spare, but authentic, a world removed from corporate discourse. He spoke of his childhood in Milan, a brief, seemingly accidental disclosure. She absorbed every detail with the focus she had been trying to suppress for months. As she prepared to depart, his hand covered hers. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and devoid of pretense. She looked down at his hand on hers, its quiet weight not a force, but a declaration of presence. It was a pressure born not of force, but of sheer intent. Her hand remained perfectly still. "You are an anomaly," he observed. The sentence was a clinical finding, devoid of romance or artifice, delivered like a scientist presenting verified data. "That's a line you use on all of them," she countered, her eyes still anchored to his hand. "I don't speak to all of them," he stated, and she accepted it as truth, utterly, without question or a need for evidence, a primal certainty that resonates in the body long before the mind can process the signal. She accepted it, and it was this very truth that terrified her to her core. Back in the sanctuary of her room, her heart hammered out a cadence she refused to decipher. A call to Sophia was met with a shriek that forced the phone from her ear. Her friend's counsel was simple. She was owed one night, a single deviation. It required no grand significance. Tomorrow, the mask of the perfect assistant would be reapplied, but tonight was a territory she could claim. Disconnecting, she stared at the ceiling for 40 uninterrupted minutes. The following day, both arrived at their meetings as flawless constructs, moving through the hours as if the prior evening was a shared hallucination. But they both knew, and that unspoken acknowledgement permanently altered the texture of every silence between them. Late that afternoon, with the day's business concluded, he swept past the doorway where she organized documents. His words were a command flung over his shoulder. "Dinner, 8 o'clock, a vital client, your attendance is required." So she complied. This was an extension of her duties, she reasoned. The venue was an intimate, hushed enclave, the kind of place where the cuisine is masterful and the sommelier has a personal history with the owner. She arrived punctually, precisely at 8. He was alone. "The client?" she inquired, her gaze sweeping the space. Dante's expression was a stoic mask that paradoxically revealed everything. A last-minute cancellation. She froze, her focus locked on him, on the table meticulously set for 2, and the glass of wine that already awaited her. This was an orchestrated event, she stated. He simply inclined his head, a gesture more conclusive than any verbal admission. "You could have informed me," she said. "And you would not have appeared," he countered. A valid point, she conceded, taking her seat. The dinner evolved into an authentic dialogue, fluid and direct, with no technology in sight. It was a seamless continuation of the connection forged at the bar. He selected the wine without glancing at a menu, an unnerving testament to how well he already knew her palate. A dry piece of wit about the Milan executive drew a laugh from her, and he observed her with an expression she could not decode. Yet it settled within her, a feeling of immense weight and substance. Midway through the meal, his hand rose to her face, unhurried, his thumb tracing a line so subtle across her cheek she almost dismissed it as imagination, but the warmth it left behind was irrefutable. "You possess a smile," he murmured, his voice lowered to that register reserved for things meant to be felt rather than heard, "that you conceal at the office." She offered no reply. She was incapable. It is a moment that still haunts her. His hand then glided down her neck, his fingertips charting a slow, deliberate path to her shoulder. From the very beginning, the heat of his palm through the fabric of her dress was a solid, undeniable presence. She summoned every reserve of self-control to keep her expression neutral, though she suspected he could read her thoughts regardless. "Dante," she said. Her own voice sounded foreign, deeper, more fragile. He responded, his hand remaining perfectly still. "You are engineering this situation." "Yes," he confirmed with absolute certainty. "I am." The sheer candor of his admission disarmed her completely. This was not a strategic maneuver. This was a man who had abandoned all pretense. He retracted his hand with deliberate slowness, and she dedicated the remainder of the dinner to regulating her own breathing. In the vehicle returning to the hotel, the silence between them was of an entirely new composition, charged and sentient. They both understood the trajectory of this path, and neither was feigning ignorance any longer. Within that profound quiet, a feral intimacy ignited, utterly unforeseen. As the car halts before the hotel, he remains motionless, a statue in the dark. I study him, he meets my gaze, and that formidable control he perpetually wields, that fortress, a fracture appears. For a moment, I could perceive the man behind the construct, not the calculating Don, nor the glacial CEO, simply a man. I exit the car. He follows me directly to his suite. Just as I am poised to offer a good night and retreat, his hand seizes my wrist. He pivots me toward him and lays claim to my mouth. And believe me, there was nothing gentle about it. It was a comprehensive tactical assault, imbued with the cumulative tension of the preceding 5 months. It was the physical manifestation of every near touch. Every glance held a fraction too long. It was the sound of every silence that had screamed between us. His mouth on mine was a key finding its designated lock after a long search. My knees gave way immediately. My hands clutched his suit for stability, and he only deepened the kiss, cradling my face, his thumb at my jaw, anchoring me as if all of chronology had ceased to exist. Yet there was no space left between our bodies. He kicked the door open and drew me inside. I offered no resistance. The suite was vast, shadowed, with the entirety of Milan glittering beneath them. I stopped, transfixed before the panoramic window. He slammed the door. We watched our silhouettes in the glass, his form stalking toward mine, his eyes connecting with my reflection before his hand settled on my waist from behind. It was an image I knew would be permanently etched into my memory. "Alessia," he said, the first time, not Romano. "Alessia," uttered in a tone that reconfigured my entire world. His lips were beside my temple, his voice so warm it felt like a physical touch. "If you wish to leave." "I don't wish to leave," I countered. And that was the final rational thought I possessed that night. Understand, the Dante Viscari in that room was not the detached executive or the intimidating figure in a power suit. He was a man gazing at me as if he had just discovered a sacred artifact he never knew he was searching for. He touched me with the same terrifying focus he applies to all things. But this time, it was threaded with a warmth so alien it was infinitely more dangerous than his typical cold-blooded persona. Chapter 5. The Aftermath. It took days for me to fully process the events that transpired. Not the physical encounter in Milan. That aspect was, to my annoyance, perfectly clear. The true cognitive dissonance lay in tracing the chain reaction that followed, in seeing how each event locked into a pattern that had been present all along. I awoke before him. Milan was still shrouded in darkness, a sea of distant lights beyond the window. I lay there, absorbing the gravity of our actions. Dante was on his side, his arm extended to the space I had just vacated. So much less the dawn, so much more the man. I slipped from the bed, collected my dress, and retreated into the bathroom. When I returned, he was awake, propped on an elbow, watching me with an intensity that sleep had failed to diminish. "Fleeing," he observed. His voice was low and raspy, deeper than its usual timbre, carrying a trace of humor that caught me completely off guard. "I need to gather my things," I stated. "My flight is at 3 o'clock." "I am aware of the flight's schedule," he replied. "It is 8 in the morning." He then rose, closed the space between us, and kissed me with the slow-burning assurance of a man in no rush. One hand on my face, the other at my waist. The kiss simply continued, systematically obliterating every logical argument I had for maintaining my distance and reverting to my role as his flawless assistant. Later, at a classic bistro, Dante revealed a dimension of himself I had never witnessed. A relaxed state that seemed entirely out of place for a boardroom predator. He actually inquired about me, not about my professional function. When I mentioned a meeting, he actually laughed. An authentic laugh, a phenomenon I had witnessed perhaps twice in 5 months, and each time it produced a strange, unsettling effect within me. At the airport and on the aircraft, we reverted to our professional roles, his arm brushing against mine. The contact was just deliberate enough to be intentional, yet casual enough to be deniable. When the car arrived at my building, he exited as well. He waited as I unlocked the gate. And when I turned to say goodnight, he was far too close for mere words. He kissed me again, a shorter, quieter version, his hand resting on my cheek for a beat before he withdrew. He stepped back, his voice that familiar low tone I now knew intimately. "I will see you tomorrow, Romano." And then he vanished. I entered my apartment, coat still in hand, and simply stood in the entryway for a long moment, experiencing a sensation I could not identify, but it was warm and real, and it granted me a night of weightless sleep I hadn't felt in an eternity. I had no idea it was the last time I would encounter that version of him. The next morning, I arrived at the office at my standard time. Dante was present in a dark suit with his coffee, documents arranged, his posture rigid, his face a blank canvas, his eyes fixed on the page, a perfect replica of day one. It was as if the last 5 months, as if Milan, as if the kiss on my own sidewalk, as if none of it had ever occurred. He glanced up as I entered, subjecting me to that quick, hierarchical scan, now completely devoid of the warmth it had held just days before. "Romano, last week's report contains a miscalculation in the third quarter projection." That was all. No hesitation, no modulation in his tone, nothing to even suggest we were anything beyond employer and employee. I just stood there for 2 seconds. The longest 2 seconds of my existence, feeling the very ground dissolve beneath me. I walked to my desk, sat, and opened my laptop. I will have it amended by 11 o'clock. By 10, he countered, his gaze already returned to his papers. And that was the end of it. I navigated the day on autopilot, a functional automaton executing tasks while my actual consciousness reeled from the psychological warfare. I corrected the report, managed his calendar, and answered every email with perfect professionalism. When I departed at 7 that evening, he did not even look up. In the restroom of a restaurant meeting Sophia, I stared at my reflection for 5 minutes, attempting to assess if I was still intact. I was not entirely sure. I am merely a footnote in his history, I finally conveyed, settling into the chair opposite her. Alesia, she began, a slight rasp in her throat. No, I countered, my grip tightening on the glass, terminating the discussion before it could fester. It was a single night. It is concluded. I am proceeding. Sophia offered only a look, an expression that communicated volumes, weighing whether to press further. She abstained. She refilled her own glass, lingering until midnight, his name never again crossing her lips, a silent testament of her loyalty. I proceeded, or rather, I attempted to. A wall of ice erected itself, not by design, but as a mechanism for survival. It is the necessary surgery one performs to excise an emotion that was never invited. Our dialogues became strictly transactional, devoid of the charged silences and the surplus of focus I had unconsciously afforded him. Dante perceived the atmospheric shift immediately. I would observe him halting mid-thought, his eyes conducting a brief, analytical scan of my face before he continued, his expression an unreadable mask I no longer sought to interpret. I presumed he was indifferent. I was profoundly mistaken. What remained unknown to me was that the night had not been an isolated incident for him either. It was he who lay staring at the ceiling, unmoored, and did what men of his archetype invariably do. He constructed a citadel. While we were both waiting, a fundamental change was occurring within me, making any pretense of insignificance impossible. Chapter 6. Lorenzo learns the malady began in the 6th week post-Milan. I convinced myself it was merely stress, a perfect scapegoat for my body's sudden betrayal. I attributed it to a new blend of coffee. I attributed it to the crushing workload of a new initiative that kept me tethered to the office until late. I maintained a rotating catalog of justifications for days. Yet the visceral unease persisted. On a Tuesday, I procured a test from a pharmacy 2 blocks from my workplace, utilizing it in the restroom during my lunch hour. I simply sat in the stall, clutching toilet paper for no reason, as 2 minutes stretched out with the gravity of a final judgment. 2 lines. I experienced no panic. Alazia Romano does not permit panic. It was one of the few absolute truths I held about my own character, and it remained intact even within that sterile corporate washroom. I gazed at the 2 lines, my cognitive functions buffering, attempting to reconcile what my eyes had already confirmed. Then I concealed the test, placed it in my purse, washed my hands, and met my own reflection. The woman staring back appeared unchanged. Impeccable blazer, rigid posture, controlled visage. But I could perceive a subtle disturbance in her eyes. It was the genesis of a hurricane that would inevitably make landfall. Regardless of the circumstances, departure was imperative. I slung my bag over my shoulder, my mind already operating in a state of crisis management. But then, as if on cue, Lorenzo materialized at my apartment unannounced, a relic of our childhood dynamic. He held a container of food as if it were the most natural act in the world, for my brother knows my habit of fasting under duress. "I have heated this for you," he announced, moving past me as if he co-signed the lease. You neglect to eat when you are troubled. I remained fused to the sofa, my laptop open, and recited the 3 standard falsehoods. I am well. Do not be concerned. I have already eaten. Lorenzo simply held my gaze for a full 30 seconds, utterly silent. You see, we possess a unique sibling telepathy. He can decipher my tells more accurately than I can myself. After 3 decades, words are superfluous. One can discern an entire narrative from the way a person holds a plastic container. His eyes effectively communicated. I am aware your life is in a state of chaos, so dispense with the pretense. He finally inquired, What is it? And I retorted, It is nothing, Elysia. I am fine, Lorenzo. So he set down the food, sat beside me, and gently lifted the laptop from my grasp. He did not need to apply force. My brother simply clears the path for the inevitable detonation of truth. The silence was his greatest tool. He would not depart until he possessed the full account, and I provided it. It was not an elegant recitation. The words erupted in a chaotic torrent, mapping the entire anatomy of the disaster. The evening in Milan, the coffee at the airport, that kiss at the curb, the subsequent office politics, and the falsified report from the 3rd quarter. I detailed the months of his calculated distance, which I had misinterpreted as simple disinterest. And then, the denouement, the restroom on Tuesday, the 2 lines on the plastic stick. When my account concluded, Lorenzo became perfectly still. It is a state I recognize intimately. It is not serenity. It is the containment of an immense destructive force. It is the posture of a man who is about to act, but is granting me the courtesy of finishing first. He rose, walked to the window, and stared down at the street below. Then he delivered the blow. I warned you. Just 2 words, but they were not an accusation. There was no hint of vindication in his tone, only the profound pain of a man who wished his prophecy had been wrong. He spoke it softly, his back to me, appearing to bear an immense weight. I know, was my only possible reply. This man, he began, but I intervened. Lorenzo! My voice was sharp, a definitive signal. I also made a choice. Do not you dare reduce me to a victim in this narrative. He turned, his eyes a maelstrom of anger, of hurt, and of something else I could not yet decipher. It resembled guilt, a guilt that seemed entirely out of context to me, a burden he carried that he was not yet ready to share. He returned to the sofa and wrapped his arm around me in that quintessential Lorenzo embrace, the one reserved for moments when language is insufficient. The very fact that he was rendered speechless communicated everything. We sat that way for some time, my head on his shoulder, his arm a solid presence while the city hummed on, oblivious to the fact that our shared world was on the verge of implosion. What is your next move? He eventually asked. His voice had changed, softer, the tone of a brother genuinely inquiring, not dictating. I am still formulating a strategy, I murmured. He nodded, falling silent once more before posing the critical question. Are you going to inform him? No, I replied instantly without hesitation. That answer had been locked in since Tuesday. Lorenzo's mouth tightened into a firm line. He did not contest the point. Not at that moment. I know my brother. He was simply placing the bookmark in that particular conflict for a later time. We remained there for another 2 hours. He opened the food container, placed a fork in my hand with a look that communicated, You will eat this, and we sat in a comfortable quiet. Sometimes, after a great truth has been unearthed, further conversation is unnecessary. But as he was departing, he held me at the door, the embrace lasting significantly longer than was typical. And a small part of my intuition recognized this as a farewell, not a permanent one, but the kind a person gives just before they undertake an action they know you will vehemently oppose. I closed the door and remained standing there, utterly alone. I had no inkling of what was to come. The truth was poised to collide with me like a freight train, but only after the wreckage had already settled. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. My brother went to perform the one act I could not, and Dante Viscari was about to receive a dose of reality that no one else had the courage to administer. I was completely unaware, staring at the glow of my laptop, attempting to compose the perfect letter of resignation. Meanwhile, Lorenzo was crossing the city, marching directly into the Viscari Holdings Tower without an appointment, without authorization, and with an absolute absence of deference. I learned the details of the event later, first from Marco in a condensed version weeks after, and then from Lorenzo himself, who claimed ownership of every moment. He approached the reception desk and stated he was there on urgent personal business. He delivered his surname with a kind of innate authority that compels people to comply, and it was effective. Upstairs, Marco Vital heard the name Romano and, acting on pure instinct, authorized the visit. Dante agreed to the meeting solely because a public confrontation in his five-star lobby was not part of his strategic plan. It was a cold, pragmatic decision. The office was utterly silent when Lorenzo entered. Dante was already standing behind his desk. Marco had seen him rise the moment the name Romano was announced over the intercom, like a man bracing for an unavoidable impact. But Lorenzo entered the space without a trace of intimidation. The billion-dollar suit, the panoramic view, the intense gaze that had likely unnerved more vulnerable men, none of it registered with him. He had learned on the streets that one must never allow another man's power to eclipse one's own. Lorenzo initiated the duel of dominance with an assertion of his identity. Dante's acknowledgement was a low, chilling calm, the placid surface over a turbulent depth. The refusal of a chair was a clear act of defiance. Dante responded by anchoring himself, his posture a study in coiled stillness, his gaze an almost tangible pressure. Then came the carefully deployed revelation, the existence of an heir, yet the statement met only a wall of impenetrable silence. Dante offered no crack in his facade. This unnerving stillness was not detachment, but the containment of a tectonic emotional shift. Lorenzo pressed his assault, condemning the attempt to depersonalize the crisis. He parried any interruption, forcing a confrontation with the human element by invoking her name, Alicia. He then detailed the visceral toll of her silent suffering, the sleepless nights, the body's rejection of sustenance, a spirit in decline. She is carrying this burden alone while you do what? Execute contracts, gaze out your window and wish this entire complication would simply cease to exist? You have no understanding of this situation. I understand everything about men like you. Lorenzo allowed that statement to resonate for a moment before delivering the final critical blow. You project an image of owning everything, the company, the decisions, the people. But the moment true responsibility is required, you retreat. You revert to being the cold executive, expecting the world to reorder itself around you. And Dante simply stood there and absorbed it in complete silence. This is not the stillness of a strategist calculating his next attack, but the vacuum following a profound psychic blow delivered by a man with nothing left to risk. Lorenzo, positioned at the doorway, meticulously times his parting shot. She believed it was a single night, he states, his voice low, his gaze averted, that she was merely one of many. A beat of silence passes. If that is the reality, tell me so I can assume the responsibility you have abdicated. We sense Lorenzo on the precipice of a full disclosure. The incoming messages, the spiraling debt, the name, whereas that was emblazoned on every collection notice, a signature he recognized far too late. But he swallows the confession. He departs, leaving a narrative time bomb, its detonation timer unknown to anyone but him. Dante now stands alone in the room. Marco materializes 2 minutes later, his arrival as predictable as a scene change, showcasing a silent mastery of navigating emotional fallout. He assesses his boss and offers only silence. Dante was at the window, his sanctuary for processing chaos. The city below operates like a mechanism capable of bringing clarity or deepening the chamber's emptiness. Leave, he says, and Marco is gone. And for the first time in what amounted to years, Dante Viscari finds himself imprisoned with the unvarnished truth of his own character. He is cornered by the words of a man unburdened by consequence, who dealt only in facts, leaving no space for a more palatable narrative. You project ownership over everything, yet when accountability is due, you retreat. He recalled Elysia, that Milan morning where he donned the armor of the boss, unable to embody the man who had just shared her bed. To be that man required acknowledging what had transpired, and that meant admitting he was utterly lost. And being lost was a psychological state Dante Viscari had spent a lifetime warding off with a discipline he had fundamentally mistaken for strength. He reflected on the preceding months, observing her strategic retreat, the Elysia, who ceased lingering, whose speech became clipped and whose gaze hardened, the gap between them a meticulously engineered chasm. He had interpreted it as her choice, a boundary he must honor, the kind of wall a man who lacks the language to ask can never surmount. If you expect her to approach you, you will wait indefinitely. He already understood this. He knew it before Lorenzo voiced it, with the visceral certainty of recognizing a toxic pattern that can no longer be denied. Despite this, he remained inert, standing on his side of the chasm, awaiting an external force to mend it. His suit was immaculate, his office a bastion of order. The city below continued its indifferent rhythm. Dante stood at that window for a considerable time. Then, in absolute silence, he made a choice. Not a move toward her, not an immediate attempt at repair, but the foundational decision that must precede all others, the choice to abandon pretense, to cease acting as if his feelings were manageable, temporary, or would dissipate if ignored. They did not disappear. They had persisted for months, and now Elysia Romano was poised to enter that very room, a letter in her possession. He knew this with the clairvoyance that comes from deep familiarity with another's playbook. She believed she was arriving to sever ties. She was profoundly mistaken. Chapter 8. With or without your consent, you will remain. I entered with the intent to resign. He announced my pregnancy before I could utter a single word. Then he said something that inverted the entire reality of the situation. The letter had been folded in my bag for 3 days, drafted on Friday, revised on Saturday, and reread on Sunday with the dispassionate logic of an editor. It was flawless. My resignation offered 2 weeks' notice, adhering strictly to the contract. The reason cited was personal, deliberately vague. As I owed no one a truth I was not prepared to commit to writing. It was a model of its kind, civil, concise, and definitive. Composing the words was not the challenge. Crossing the threshold of his office was. I delayed for 3 days, inventing reasons, searching for an opening in his calendar, waiting for the fortitude to face him without my expression betraying me. 3 days of ascending to the 10th floor, letter in my bag, only to descend with it still concealed. It was a categorical failure of courage. On Monday, I awoke with the acute, cold awareness of a decision that must be executed before my resolve could falter again. I arrived at the office at the standard hour, greeted Carla, and poured my coffee. The same perfect blend delivered daily, a ritual maintained to deflect the inquiries my abstention would invite. I was, in essence, fleeing from the need to explain. I held the mug in the hallway, gazing at his closed door, taking one final unsteady breath before I entered. Dante was at the window, his back to me, his shoulders immense within a dark, faultless suit, but an element in his posture gave me pause. This was not a man idly observing the view. This was the stance of a man in waiting, one who knew I was present, yet deliberately remained turned away, wielding the same psychological control he exerted over all things. "I need a moment of your time," I said. He turned, his eyes fixed on me for a silent, charged beat. I had catalogued every one of his expressions, but this one carried a different intensity. It was not the look of a superior, nor the one from Milan. It was an expression I had never witnessed, and its unfamiliarity was deeply unsettling, for I had believed I knew them all. I produced the letter, gripping it with both hands like someone asserting control, and declared, "I am resigning." 2 weeks' notice per our agreement. The ensuing silence was palpably heavy. Dante made no move for the letter. His gaze never left me. He simply stood there, his eyes locked on mine, and said, "The reason, personal, Romano." His voice became glacial. It did not rise in volume, but acquired a steel edge that signaled the end of professional decorum. This was now something else. A reason. I was not required to provide one. You are pregnant. The quiet that followed this declaration stretched for 6 entire seconds. My mind catalogued each second as my body went into systemic shock. I neither confirmed nor denied it. I simply stood there, letter in hand, as those seconds fell like weights. My entire world had just been inverted, a fact I registered with a clarity that preceded any emotional response. "How could you know?" The words were less a question and more the only coherent sentence I could form, my voice barely a whisper. His silence was all the confirmation required. Lorenzo. The name surfaced in my mind with the sickening certainty of seeing a sibling's signature on a document of betrayal. That embrace, it was a farewell freighted with unspoken meaning. Lorenzo was gone, and I had been so submerged in my own turmoil that I had failed to perceive the dynamics unfolding before me. Dante began to cross the room. His pace was unhurried but laden with purpose, each step a testament to conviction, not uncertainty. It was the stride of a man who perceives victory as a foregone conclusion. He stopped directly before me, far too close for a professional setting, too close for any casual interaction. The space between us collapsed until my entire nervous system was alight with his proximity. I raised my chin. The letter remained in my hand, the sole object in the universe over which I still held dominion. "I no longer wish to be here," I stated, my voice fortified by necessity. "You have your life. I have my own." Dante remained silent, his gaze fixed on me. Not the document, not the letter. Me. He looked at me with an intensity I recognized as his most authentic self, the one that emerged when his formidable control fractured, revealing the core beneath. And then he spoke, like it or not. Each word was placed with a heavy, deliberate calm. You are staying. I opened my mouth to object. This child is mine. 4 words. 4 words delivered in a low, absolute tone that was neither threat nor plea. It was a declaration of fact, a kind of certainty that requires no external validation. It was the voice of a man who had already determined the shape of the future and was now simply articulating the new terms of reality. I stared at him and he returned my gaze. In his eyes was something I had never seen in any iteration of him. Not the boss, not the man from Milan, not the cold barrier he had erected. It was something that predated all of those constructs, something far more elemental. It was the Dante Viscari that exists without armor, the man I had glimpsed once and assumed I would never see again. The letter in my hand suddenly felt both meaningless and immensely heavy. Meaningless because the reality for which it was written had ceased to exist. Heavy because I was still holding it, unsure if I could release it. You cannot simply, I began. I am not being simple, he interrupted, not with harshness, but with the stark directness that was his own distorted form of honesty. I'm stating what is. What is? I retorted, my voice breaking in a way I hadn't intended. And then we witnessed the fissure in his armor, the kind of structural failure that results from prolonged, immense pressure. She confronts him. You disappeared. You treated me as just another employee, and now... He cuts her off. I know what I did. 3 words. No defense, no excuse, none of the typical self-serving rhetoric, just the unvarnished admission. She presses her lips together, her throat constricting, determined to conceal her reaction. This resolves nothing, she says. No, he concedes, but it is where we begin. The air between them is dense with the ghost of Milan. That morning after, and 6 unbroken months of a silence that neither won, a fragile silence she had dared to shatter, a truce whose terms she was only now beginning to comprehend. The entire unspoken contract was visible in the chasm between her defiance and his immutable gaze. The letter, an artifact of a former reality, remained in her grasp. Dante's eyes register its presence for a microsecond before returning to her, his focus absolute. He exerts no pressure, makes no demand. He simply occupies the space, a force of profound stillness, and waits. This newfound patience proves more unsettling than his prior methods of control ever were. Her autonomy was a fortress built on a personal declaration of independence. The letter, her own apartment 20 minutes away, a life constructed without the need for a male architect. She understood these facts, even under his unwavering scrutiny, yet she remained. Her presence was not a concession to his authority, nor a denial of the past's betrayals. She stayed because his pronouncement, "This baby is mine," was an axiom of such finality that her body accepted it long before her mind could process the implications. And because for the first time, Dante Viscari had let the mask of the pragmatist fall away. Chapter 9. The Abduction. The event occurred on a day of crushing normalcy, the precise moment when past sins demand their payment. In the weeks following their office confrontation, she had remained, rationalizing her stasis with the stubborn logic of a heart at war with itself. She was angered by his refusal to let her go, a state distinct from the desire to stay, and a world away from admitting the letter she held was a message that would now never be sent. Their dynamic had shifted into a delicate, high-stakes equilibrium balanced on a tightrope of unspoken truths and the echoes of his claim. Lorenzo's arrival on that Thursday was the manifestation of a coming storm. He was a phantom of his former self, his trademark charming smile now a hollow, strained imitation. Craters of exhaustion ringed his eyes, the wrinkled state of his shirt, a minute detail so contrary to his nature, was a clear signal of his internal collapse. The warning signs had been escalating for weeks. The clandestine phone calls, the fiscal evasiveness, the temporary residence that had become his home for 3 months. She had ignored them, a choice she was now beginning to regret. "The debts," she stated, cutting through the pretense. "Is it worse?" "I am handling it," he retorted, the defensive clip in his words betraying his usual composure. His gaze flickered away before snapping back to meet hers. She held it. "Lorenzo, explain precisely what is happening." "This is not your burden to bear." His tone was harsh, a severe deviation from his character. "But you must be safe, do you understand? Be aware of everything. In the vehicle, among others. Maintain a state of high alert." "You are frightening me." "I am being prudent." He leveled a look at her she recognized, one reserved for matters of life and death. "Promise me you will remain vigilant." She agreed, grasping only the gravity, not the cause. She would only understand later, when the disparate, violent pieces of the narrative coalesced, that he was already submerged. He had received the threats, the impossible demands, and finally a photograph of her taken from a distance as she left her workplace. Beneath it, the chilling caption, "We know her value to you both." He had said nothing, shouldering the terror alone in the belief he could contain the cyclone before it reached her. Her medical appointment was perfectly routine. The car awaiting her outside the clinic was an exact replica of Dante's. Identical model, identical color, with the license plate she had committed to memory. Such perfect mimicry is not coincidence. It is the culmination of meticulous planning fueled by insider information. It requires time, resources, and flawless execution. The driver's wave appeared entirely natural as she approached. He opened the door, speaking her name with practiced familiarity. She slid into the seat, but in that instant she knew. The scent was wrong. It lacked the signature leather and the specific fragrance used by Dante's regular driver. The seat's texture was subtly different, a detail imperceptible to anyone else. She opened her mouth to speak, but the opportunity was gone. The act was swift, clinical, executed with the cold logic that perfection is invisible, while chaos invites scrutiny. They had neutralized Dante's greatest strategic asset, his ability to react. She regained consciousness bound to a chair. The room was small, the air thick. A low, artificial light obscured any sense of time. Her hands were secured behind her with professional knots, a clear signal of her captor's expertise. In the face of overwhelming threat, she reverted to fundamental analysis. She began to count. 3 men were visible, with more moving outside the door. She mapped the space through its acoustics. No windows. A single door secured externally. The environment was climate-controlled, a professional setup, not a derelict warehouse. Then her mind locked onto the child, a presence within her that was solely hers, a final anchor of identity. She took one slow breath, then another, employing a self-calming technique honed over a lifetime of crisis. Her thoughts turned to Dante, not with the romantic hope of a damsel awaiting rescue, but with the cold certainty of one who understands a man's core programming. This baby is mine. A man who utters those words with that conviction does not abandon his claim. This was not hope. It was strategic assessment. It provided the necessary calm. At 2 in the afternoon, Lorenzo's phone illuminated with a second photograph. It depicted her in the chair, wrists bound, but alive. Unharmed, but unequivocally a hostage. Below the image was a single, terrifying directive. You know who holds our funds? Go to him immediately. We are observing all movements. And so, Lorenzo ran. He moved through the city, the phone in his hand, its screen burning with the image of his failure. He burst into Viscari Holdings, his breathing ragged, like a man collapsing under an impossible weight. Marco registered the raw desperation in his eyes and, forgoing protocol, led him directly upstairs. Dante was at the window when Lorenzo entered. He turned, and the sheer agony on the brother's face caused his entire frame to lock with a rigidity Marco had rarely witnessed. "Speak," Dante ordered, and the entire sordid truth emerged. He confessed everything: the threats, the escalating demands, the debt that had spiraled beyond his control, and the sickening realization that his creditors were proxies for Victor Srokin. He admitted to the first picture of her, the one he had concealed for weeks in the arrogant belief that he could resolve the crisis himself. Then he spoke of today's photograph. "I never imagined they would involve her," Lorenzo choked, his voice finally fracturing. "I swear I never anticipated this." Dante remained silent. Lorenzo would later reflect that this silence was the most profound weight he had ever experienced. It was not anger. It was something far more formidable, the absolute control of a man containing a seismic rage. Then the desk phone began to ring. The number was private. Dante seized the receiver before it could ring a second time. His action fluid, decisive. He knew who was calling. The voice on the other end was saturated with a cold, artificial calm, the kind used as a psychological weapon. "Dante Viscari." A deliberate pause followed. "I trust you are now apprised of the girl's new location." Dante's quiet was its own response. "Lorenzo Romano proved to be the ideal instrument," Victor stated, his tone flat with the satisfaction of a successful gambit. "His debt was our entry point, his sister our leverage, and you, another calculated beat. You were our primary objective." Dante inclined his head toward the window, his jawline like granite. "The conditions are straightforward, Victor went on. You will cede the contested territory, you will relinquish access, you will absorb all of Romano's debt. Comply with these terms, and she will be returned." The proposition was impossible, not due to the finances, but for the fundamental shift in power it signified. It was a demand for unconditional surrender, something Dante would never contemplate, regardless of the pressure, save for this one singular exception. "You have 2 hours, Victor cautioned. Thereafter, the cost will increase, and I cannot assure you of her condition, or that of the child." The line went dead. The ensuing silence in the office was a new echelon of dread, something Marco had never known in all his years of service. It was not rage. It was the precursor to it, something darker, more elemental. It was the quiet implosion of a man who had structured his life around the protection of his lineage, now confronted with the possibility of failure. Lorenzo stood, ashen, finally comprehending the catastrophic scale of his miscalculation. Dante, he whispered, his voice broken. I did not know. I know, Dante replied, his own voice low and sharp, yet devoid of accusation. He was already in motion, his decision rendered the instant Victor mistakenly believed he had 2 hours to negotiate. Marco would later speak of those next 2 hours with the clipped brevity of a man who had witnessed something he would never revisit. Dante conceded no strategic advantage, refusing to sign anything. He activated 3 clandestine contacts Marco dared not identify, and whose names were never solicited. In under 40 minutes, he possessed the warehouse coordinates, an estimate of hostiles within, and verification that Victor was acting rogue, a freelancer without syndicate sanction. It was a charade built on borrowed force. And Dante, an expert in deconstructing hollow threats, dismantled the entire operation before Victor's 2-hour ultimatum expired. Details of the warehouse incursion emerged only in fragments. No shots were discharged. Dante's teams executed a synchronized, 3-pronged assault. Victor allegedly received a call from his true superior mid-operation, the content of which prompted a precipitous withdrawal moments before Dante's arrival. Thereafter, an absolute silence fell. A profound stillness then descended upon the warehouse. The first sensory shift was the absence of the background noises she had grown accustomed to. Shuffling feet, indistinct voices, the groan of a chair. It was as if the world's audio had been abruptly muted. This new quiet was not a void. It was saturated with the residual energy of a hasty abandonment, a palpable tension. An event had transpired outside, but its nature, whether salvation or doom, remained unknown, and this ignorance was a corrosive agent. She maintained perfect stillness, regulating her breath, channeling all her awareness to the nascent life inside her. That vital presence became her sole point of stability as she waited with the primal resilience of a woman afforded no alternative but survival. Seconds dilated into minutes, each an eternity, until the door was finally breached. Dante appeared first, a solitary figure in a dark suit, his posture rigid. His gait, typically as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, was altered. It was swift yet deliberate, the measured, tactical advance of a man executing a flawless stratagem conceived and rehearsed countless times in his mind. In less than 2 seconds, his gaze dissected the room before it found her, and in that instant, their eyes locked. Her initial reaction was not one of relief. It was something deeper, more elemental, the expression of a man who had prepared for perdition and was now recalibrating his mind to accept reality. Her, breathing. Her, intact. Her hand resting on her abdomen, her stare fixed on his even as restraints bound her to a chair. Because Elysia Romano never averted her gaze. He traversed the space silently and knelt before her. That singular gesture, Dante Viscari on one knee, landed with a force that shattered her composure before any defense could be mounted. His hands moved to the ropes at her wrists, sharp and efficient, and the knots seemed to cede to his touch instantly. The moment the ropes fell away, he enveloped her hands in his. He did not squeeze, but simply held them, a profound warmth that felt like a desperately needed sustenance she hadn't known she was lacking. His eyes conducted a systematic scan of her body, a cold, urgent search for injuries born from hours of imagining the direst outcomes. He was still contending with the ghosts of what might have been. "You're okay," he murmured, a reassurance aimed more at himself, as if verbalizing it would cement the fact. "I am," she replied. His hand rose to her face, his thumb stroking her cheek as their eyes finally reconnected. and within their depths she perceived a vulnerability she had never before seen in him. This was not the capo, nor the detached man from Milan. It was not the fortress he had erected around his core, a bastion that was already crumbling to dust. This was the man beneath, stripped of all armor, exposed by the crucible of the preceding hours, which had made any pretense untenable. The moment was ephemeral. He rose, placing his hands on her waist to assist her to her feet. He paused before her, absorbing her presence, as if requiring that extra beat to fully process her wholeness. In the car, a heavy silence settled for 2 full minutes while she stared out the window. His focus remained on the road, but the tension was still etched in his jaw, in the set of his shoulders, and in the way his hands gripped his own knee, residual evidence of the internal battle he had just waged. "You were afraid," he stated, as a point of fact. "Yes." "Of what?" She finally turned to meet his profile. He did not reciprocate her gaze, but the question was charged with the need for an authentic response. She could have offered numerous truths: the squalid warehouse, the crushing uncertainty. Any would have been simpler, safer than the one she chose. "Of never seeing you again," she conceded. The ensuing silence possessed a quality distinct from all that had preceded it. A muscle twitched in his jaw. The hand resting on his knee relocated, slowly and with great deliberation, to find hers in the space between them. It remained there. He held her hand for the duration of the journey back to his residence, and neither acknowledged the gesture. It was one of those fragile understandings that gestate best in quietude. Dante and Alicia had learned, through painful experience, that words can sometimes devalue what is most profound. That unspoken dialogue became more than a mere memory. It evolved into a foundation. The words she had spoken, her voice trembling with a formidable truth, his subsequent silence, and the unwavering pressure of his hand. These were the initial bricks they laid. They were unaware of the structure they were creating, but both understood that construction had begun. 3 weeks after her rescue, she was residing in his apartment. This was not the result of a discussion, it was simply a gradual surrender of the defenses she had long maintained. A process accelerated by the abduction, by those words in the car, and by a single afternoon when, upon returning to her own home, an instinct to call him was met with the sharp pang of his absence in a room that was supposed to be hers. She never disclosed that moment to him. She simply arrived with a single suitcase, and he refrained from commenting on its modest size. That was their method. But a nonverbal language has its limitations, and they reached theirs in the 2nd week. She awoke at 3 a.m. to find his side of the bed cold. She discovered him by the living room window, phone in hand, wearing the same remote expression of the man she first met. He was emotionally inaccessible, on a different plane she could not reach. When she inquired what was amiss, he retorted with a terse, "Work." The tone was identical to the one he used before Milan, a clear signal that the door was closed. She returned to their room and watched the ceiling until dawn, contemplating whether she had made a monumental error. The breaking point was a conflict over Lorenzo's rehabilitation, ignited by her discovery of a bank statement. She confronted him, not about his financial support, but about the concealment. Secrecy was the precise toxin that had destroyed them before, and if he was merely deploying old tactics in a new context, she needed immediate clarification. "I paid because it was necessary," he stated, his voice devoid of inflection. "You concealed it because that is your nature," she retorted. The subsequent silence was the familiar, suffocating kind she refused to endure again. After a long pause, he finally spoke, the effort visible in his jaw before she heard the words. "I don't yet know how to be different," he admitted, "but I am trying." It was a minimal offering, yet it was genuine, and she was beginning to understand that with Dante, honesty was the only currency with real value. Lorenzo was in a clinic for men who had lost everything to gambling, an institution that provided the structure he required to break his addiction. He had gone voluntarily for the first time, a fact she was still attempting to reconcile weeks later. Lorenzo had always been the caretaker, the one who shouldered everyone's burdens with a strained smile and embraces that lingered too long. This new version of him, one who conceded his own brokenness, was a person she was learning to perceive through a haze of both relief and sorrow, the kind one feels knowing that intervention only arrived because the alternative was annihilation. She visited him each Tuesday, a quiet, consistent presence, aware that her brother needed routine more than rhetoric. Dante was financing the entire endeavor. She learned this by pure chance, a statement misplaced in a folder bearing the clinic's name and his signature. She simply gazed at the document, a warmth igniting within her that she dared not name. To name it would be to accept it, and she lacked that courage. She said nothing. He said nothing. It was their unique language. Concepts transmitted between them without being articulated, which at times felt insufficient and at others felt like everything. One Wednesday evening, he returned home to find her on the balcony. The city was spread out beneath them, its architecture traced in gold against a violet sky. She was looking out, hands on the railing, the subtle curve of her pregnancy newly visible. A profound tranquility had descended with the evening, a type of peace she had almost forgotten. She heard the door, then his footsteps, a sound whose every variation she now knew intimately. She recognized the particular cadence of his walk when his first act upon arriving was to find her. He paused at the balcony's entrance, observing her for a moment, and in his distant expression, she saw something she could feel but could not define. It was the expression of a man witnessing something wholly unexpected, requiring a moment to process the sight. He approached, standing so near that their arms almost brushed. For the first time in what seemed an age, the silence between them was not heavy. It was comfortable. This was not the strained quiet of unspoken conflict, but the easy stillness of two people coexisting in a shared space. "Lorenzo called," she stated. "I know. He mentioned he contacted you before all of this happened." A pause ensued. "Said you were angry," she added. "I was, but he was not mistaken." Dante turned, and his entire defense was gone, revealing a vulnerability she had never seen in him. This was not the formidable crime lord, the polished seducer, or the executive who commanded every space he occupied. This was a man humbled by his own brother's sharp truths, still reeling weeks later. "He has an infuriating talent for being right," Dante conceded. A laugh escaped her, spontaneous and unrestrained. He observed her with an expression she recognized, one that communicated he was archiving this very moment, cataloging a thought not yet ready for words. The quiet that followed was not awkward. It felt like an arrival. "I was a fool," he stated, devoid of the usual defenses people erect around their greatest errors. "With you." Following that evening in Milan, she understood her own feelings and immediately erected an immense emotional barrier as a defense against the ensuing turmoil. "It wasn't," she murmured. "No, it wasn't," he concurred. "You never uttered a single word." I am aware. His gaze remained fixed upon hers. I allowed you to believe you were merely another conquest, because the emotion I felt was terrifying, and I possessed no language for it. So I defaulted to my only known tactic when I am cornered. You constructed a wall, she concluded for him. I constructed a wall, he confessed, completely unguarded. This was the unvarnished honesty he reserved for moments of the highest consequence. That cannot simply undo the past several months, she countered. No, he acknowledged. But it is the truth, and you are entitled to that above all else. He retrieved an object from his pocket. It was understated, not the sort of ostentatious jewelry designed to attract notice. It was an unadorned, dark gold ring that seemed to carry a history. She would later learn it was a replica of his mother's ring, his sole model for such a gesture, and that its selection had caused him more anxiety than any other choice that year. He presented it but did not kneel. Such a display was antithetical to his nature, and she wouldn't have wanted it. A kneeling Dante would feel like a performance, and this moment demanded absolute authenticity. I don't know the proper way to do this, he admitted, his voice low, a tone so distinctly his. In this singular instant, it was unrepeatable. I have no concept of how to be with someone without transforming it into a contest for dominance. I don't know how to love in a manner that isn't frightening, both to them and to me. She allowed him to speak. But I have learned one thing. His focus intensified, locking onto hers with his signature severity. The only time I have ever experienced genuine fear was in your absence. I was essentially suffocating, uncertain I could reach you in time. You were counting, she whispered, every last one. The realization did not strike her with force. It enveloped her, the way profound truths often do, gradually and with absolute certainty. Dante Viscari, a man whose existence revolved around control, emotional distance, and self-sufficiency, had been tracking every single minute she was gone. He did not force the ring onto her finger. He laid it in her open palm with a slow, considered motion. It was the distinction between a directive and a request, between making her choice and empowering her to decide. Stay, he said, not for our child, not as a command, but because I am asking you. You despise asking, she observed. I do, he confirmed with a candor that was almost comical. This is the closest I'll get to a proposal, isn't it? For the time being, he retorted, a novel humor emerging as his defenses receded. I suppose you could improve with practice? She laughed, a genuine, buoyant sound that arises only in the company of the right person. He watched her with that same expression from the bistro in Milan, a look she now fully comprehended. It was the face of a man who just realized he wanted to witness that exact sight for the remainder of his days. She guided the ring onto her own finger. You're going to require a great deal of practice, she informed him. His hand moved to her stomach, unhurried and deliberate, with a gentleness still foreign to him, but a currency he was evidently prepared to spend. His hand remained there, a warm, steady presence over his place where their child was developing, entirely unaware of the profound drama of its parents. We have time, he stated. We have time. Her brother's admonitions replayed in her mind. Dangerous, a manipulator, uncontrollable. He was correct on all three counts. He was mistaken on only one point. He believed these traits would repel her. Instead, they were precisely the reasons she remained. She didn't grasp it then, but by choosing him, she was consenting to all the chaos that would follow. This is Lena. And while that concludes Book 1, my work on Book 2 is already complete. You can gain entry for a very modest fee. The envelope bore no return address. Assuming it was business, she tore it open, anticipating yet another tedious contract. Inside, however, were dates, files, and messages she had never seen, along with a final handwritten sentence. The script was unfamiliar, yet it possessed the chilling equanimity of someone certain they are about to incinerate a world. He didn't just know about your brother's financial troubles. He orchestrated them, steering Lorenzo toward the very circumstances that led to your abduction. Ask him his motive. The paper fell from her grasp. She looked at the ring, at her stomach, at the door behind which Dante worked, oblivious that she now held proof the man who pleaded for her to stay had engineered her entire ordeal. Dante's intervention was not a rescue. He had extracted her from a snare of his own design. And for the first time since accepting his proposal, she questioned if this was where she truly belonged. As you might surmise, this is merely a glimpse into Book 2. For the complete, unedited narrative, you need only click the first link in the pinned comment. I will meet you there in a moment. To be clear, that top link in the comments leads directly to the entire second book, free of advertisements or interruptions. It is genuinely that simple. I had a phenomenal time creating Book 2, and thanks to your amazing support, there is certainly more to come. On that platform, you will discover narratives that explore far deeper and more intense themes. This is authentic, dark romance. Because this material is considerably more mature, it is not suitable for me to post on public YouTube. This exclusive venue allows me to express my full creative vision and produce my finest work for you all. A quick note that the channel is no longer monetized. This project is the sole means by which I can support my team and continue delivering these high-caliber stories. I will be providing more updates shortly. I will be looking for you via that first link in the pinned comment. Regrettably, there have been numerous incidents of individuals pirating our audio, stealing the complete story, and simply re-uploading it to YouTube.
Life lesson: the greatest heartbreak is not betrayal alone, but arriving too late at the truth. He stood at the window like a man who had spent his life mistaking height for clarity. The city moved beneath him in obedient patterns, headlights drifting through the dusk like veins of gold, while inside the room a different kind of darkness gathered, one made not of night but of withheld words. She entered carrying her resignation letter the way a soldier carries a final wound, carefully, privately, with dignity already rehearsed. There was no thunder, no violin, only the fragile sound of paper between her fingers and the unbearable quiet of two people who had already changed each other beyond repair. This is where the lesson becomes devastating. In many lives, the tragedy is not that love never appears, it is that truth arrives after pride has already done its work. He had loved her long before he knew how to say it. She had needed him long before she was willing to confess it. Yet between feeling and speech stood that ancient destroyer of human lives, fear. His fear took the form of distance. Hers took the form of departure, and so the room filled with all the things neither one had buried successfully. When he told her that the child was his, it did not sound like possession alone. It sounded like a man trying too late to speak from the naked center of himself. When she looked at him, the true conflict was not whether she believed him, it was whether belief could repair the months of coldness that had come before. That is the lesson the camera would linger on, not merely the confession, but the cost of the delayed confession. The life that might have been gentler if two people had spoken sooner. The tears never cried at the right hour. The comfort never given in the exact moment it was needed. Her brother, too, belongs in this tragedy. He is the man holding the storm with bare hands, trying to protect her while drowning in his own failures. He carries guilt like wet wool. He moves through the story with the doomed tenderness of someone who believes he can absorb fate on behalf of the people he loves. And so the final lesson flickers not in action but in ache. Human beings do not suffer only because they lose each other. They suffer because they keep choosing silence until fate speaks for them. By the time truth finally steps into the light, it is often carrying a knife, a child, a coffin, or all three.